Welcome to the studio. I'm Natalie. Today we're going to make a classic lined tote bag together. So here's what you're going to need. This is my sample. So this is one size that you are going to be able to make. I also put together a smaller size. So all of the dimensions, the finished dimensions, will be listed in the description, as well as what pattern pieces you're going to need to cut. So it has handles that are long enough to wear on your shoulder, which is nice. And it has an outer pocket on either side that's big enough for your phone if you want, or your keys or whatever. And that's what it looks like. So I used a free tutorial on YouTube, and I'll also link that in the description as my base for the pattern. I did make some modifications, and the YouTube tutorial was pretty sparse. It didn't really have anything about seam allowance or any specific instructions, mostly just told you what to cut out and then showed you how to sew it. So I'll be going a little more in depth into what fabrics to use and just stepping us through the process. So I have my pieces cut out, and again, I'll put all the dimensions in the description, so you don't have to remember them or pause or anything like that. But you're gonna need 2 outer fabrics and then a lining. I have an undyed cotton twill that I'm gonna be using, and then these are just from my stash, so I just grabbed them. And then I have this red canvas. So when choosing your outer fabrics, I definitely recommend choosing fabrics that are similar in weight so that they're not fighting each other. And also, if they are, like these two are a little bit different in weight. The twill is much more stretchy, just mechanically stretchy and drapey. And then this canvas is very stiff. So there is a little funkiness when sewing them together, but not a huge deal. If you're new to sewing, I would recommend trying this out with quilting cotton if you want to do that first, just because it's easier to sew with, easier to handle, and you can sew through the whole project before using a stiffer fabric. So that's an option as well. So I have my kind of main fabric and then my contrast fabric here. And then I have a lining. So I'm using this is just a yarn dyed cotton poplin, which is just a tighter weave of cotton, similar to a quilting cotton. But you can use a quilting cotton or anything like that. Like a lawn might be too light, but quilting cotton, or even you could use some of the canvas too, if you wanted that as the lining. So that's my lining. And then I have my pieces cut out. So the kind of main body of the bag, which is like the upper part of the bag, you're gonna need 2 pieces. And again, dimensions are gonna be in the description. The outer pocket, you'll need 2 of these. And then the bottom of the bag is gonna be here. You'll see I have half of my tote bag sewn, but just ignore that for now. So I have the bottom of the bag cut out. You'll just need 1 of those. And then you'll need 2 straps in the contrast fabric. So not a ton of pattern pieces. The last one you'll need is your lining. You'll just need 1 of these. And optionally, I have cut out and sewn on some bows for this one. So if you want to add a little bow detail, you'll need 4 strips for your bows. So that's what we're starting with. To start out, I'm gonna go over to the iron and do some ironing. But first, let's go through other tools that you're gonna need. Cutting tools, so if you're using rotary or scissors, you're gonna wanna get those. If you're using rotary, of course, you're gonna want a mat to cut on and a plexi ruler. You're gonna need some pins and clips. Probably, if you don't have clips, that's fine, but clips are always helpful for bulkier fabrics just on the side. So I like having those around. And then I'm using a Microtex 8012 needle. So Microtex is nice because they're very sharp and they go through, like an 80 is gonna be good for thicker fabrics. You could even, if it's really thick, you could go for a 90. But the Microtex is super sharp, so it'll just go through that canvas or twill like butter. You can also use a denim or jeans needle. It'll be very similar. Top stitching needle, only if you're doing top stitching, really. And then I have the usual snips and a seam ripper and marking tools. So sometimes I use this Choco liner in white, and then sometimes I use just a regular mechanical pencil. Always test out your marking tools before you start to make sure that they're gonna come off in a way that you like. Sometimes the Choco liner comes off too quickly for me, but certain colors of the Choco liner tend to stain, so just check that out before you mark your final fabric. So let's head over to the ironing board, and we are going to kind of prep our fabric before we start sewing. I've already pressed the top of my pocket, but you'll see that the pocket has a long side and a short side. So it's 7 inches by 6 inches. On one of the 6-inch lengths, you're going to want to press it a 1/4 inch and then a 1/4 inch again. And that'll be the top hem of our pocket that we'll sew down. Just going to give it one more. And then I'm going to fold the body piece of the bag in half this way, and I'm just going to press either end. I'm not going to press all the way along this end. I just want to find the center, and so I'll use these center points to match up my pocket later. So that's it for those. And then I have the bow pieces. If you are interested in adding bows to your bag, what I'm going to do is I'm going to press it in half and then I'm going to press either side towards the center evenly. So just basically into quarters lengthwise. So I'm making like a skinny little strand. Just watch out for your fingers. And then I'm going to just press it together one last time. So there we go for our bow, and I'll set that aside. And then last, we're gonna press our straps, and we'll do them the same way that we did our bows. So if you have a fabric with a right side and a wrong side, you're just going to want to make sure that you're pressing it wrong sides together with the right side facing out. So we have it pressed in half, and then we'll press the halves in towards the center. And then again, fold it in half and meet up your 2 folded edges and press. And since there are 2 straps, you'll do those the same. There are 4 bows, you'll do all of those the same. And there are 2 pockets, you'll do those the same. And then also with the upper bag, you'll do the same thing with that. So just repeat all those steps for the other pieces. We're gonna start by edge stitching the top of the pocket. So I am just going to stitch about maybe like 1/8 of an inch away from where the folded edge is. I'm using an edge stitch foot, which helps you line up your needle with whatever edge you're stitching on. So it has this guide, this metal bar in the middle, and then you can move your needle to the left or right to help you go in a straight line, basically. It really helps a lot. So, and I'm not going to be back stitching here because the sides of the pocket are going to get sewn into the bag. So don't worry about that. I am using my default stitch length on my sewing machine, which is a 2.5. So you can use that. You can use whatever the default stitch length is on your machine, whatever you'd like. So for now, I'm just going to sew this down. And I'm not back stitching at the start or end because the edge of the pocket, both pockets are going to get sewn into the bag. So that is it for this. You'll want to do that for both of your outer pockets. I'm going to set this aside to get pressed in a little bit. Next, we're going to do the strap. You're going to have 2 of these to do. I'm going to start by edge stitching the edge closed that is the 2 folds. So I am going to line that up with my edge stitch foot and move my needle over. So I'm actually going to do both sides of the strap, but I'm going to start with the open side first. And again, you don't need to back stitch here because it's going to get sewn into the seam. So one tip that I like to give, especially when sewing heavy fabrics or anything that's super long, is that it's really good to support your project as much as you can. The feed dogs of your machine aren't very strong and you're working against gravity. So anything hanging off of your machine before it goes through the feed dogs is pulling your project down, even if it's something like this strap. So what I like to do, so that I don't have my hands right up next to the needle, is I lift up the project as it's being fed into the machine, and then I use my left hand to kind of guide it near the needle. But I'm using a very light touch when I'm doing this because 1, I don't want to strain my hands, and 2, overhandling your fabric is never a good idea because it can get kind of, stretched out of shape, and you're actually kind of fighting with the machine when you're doing too much as it's going into the feed dogs. So really lifting up the fabric and steering it from up here and then using my left hand to guide it near the needle. I'm not using pins here. I will say you should use pins whenever you need them or want them. I don't use pins that often. I use them when I need to, and that's just how I like to sew. One side of our strap is sewn, and I'm going to turn it around and sew the other side. So this should be the side with that's the folded edge. And this is kind of a design detail just to make the strap look finished and even. All right, and our strap is done. So you'll repeat that for your second strap. I'm going to set this aside and press it in a minute. For our bows, we're going to do the same thing. So I'm actually just going to stitch one side of the bow because this is a very small piece of fabric. So I'm just going to stitch it closed. And it's up to you whether you want to backstitch here, or you can finish the little ends of the bow either by hand stitching, or I just left mine unfinished because I don't mind and I don't think it's gonna come undone. So I will just start with that. And I'm just going to stop and align my fabric. Okay. You might have a little bit of fraying on the end of these pieces, but you can just trim it off. And then if you're adding the bows, you'll just repeat that for all 4 of those. And we'll go back to the ironing board and press these pieces. Okay, so I'm just gonna, you'll see how this is kind of twisting. So I'm just gonna get my iron on there. I'm not gonna like stretch it or anything, but I'm just gonna kind of lay it flat and let the steam do the work. To let the fibers relax. So that is good. I can set that aside. So you'll just repeat that for all 4 of your bows. And then the strap also is doing a little bit of curving. So I'm just gonna hit that. The other thing that happens is there's kind of, the fabric is kind of rippling. So another good reason to press here. Pressing also helps set your stitches into the fabric. So oftentimes beginner sewists, or some not beginner sewists, are kind of avoidant of using the iron, but I always like to advocate for using it because it really just gives your project a nice finished look, and it can really elevate and like transform a project that can look maybe not great, and you hit it with an iron and it's kind of like magic. One of the bits of advice I give about ironing is that you don't want to overhandle the fabric, especially when you're using steam, because the fibers are getting relaxed, and the more relaxed they are, the more easy it is to manipulate them and stretch out your pattern pieces. So I usually just try to let the piece rest on the ironing board, and I kind of help lay it out for where I want it to be, but I don't touch it too much while it's there. Okay, so I'm gonna grab a marking tool real quick. So I have a mechanical pencil, and I have a ruler, and I'm gonna mark the center of my pocket. So I know it's 3 inches. This This is 6-inch wide, so 3 inches to the center. And I'm just gonna mark the bottom here, and I'm gonna fold the top because I don't want to have a mark on there. So I'm just folding it so I'll be able to see that crease there. You can also use what's called a Hera marker, and that's kind of like a creasing tool. They're pretty cool. And then on here, I think I will mark the center. So I already creased it, but I'm just gonna do a little bit just so I know. Just a very, you probably can't even see it, but it's just a very small marking. So if you have a print on your fabric and it's directional, you're going to want to make sure that you're lining up your pocket and your main fabric in the correct direction. I'm going to pin this here. I'm going to put 4 pins on this. So I've lined up with the center of the main piece. And if it's a little off, it's going to be fine. And I have, as you can see, the pocket will be entered this way. So I've matched up the raw edge of the bottom of the pocket with the raw edge of the upper bag piece. Okay. These are really just to help us keep this in place. So I'm going to go sew this. I'm going to baste this down along each side of the pocket on the left and the right side. And this basting stitch is just going to stay in there. We're not going to take it out later. It's just to keep this in place before we attach the strap. All right, so I'm putting this on a basting stitch, which on my machine is 5, a length of 5. And then I'm just gonna baste this down about 3/8 of an inch from either edge. And again, you don't have to backstitch here. Just make sure you remove your pins as you go. I like to trim down my threads as I go so they don't get in my way later. And I'll do the same on the opposite side. All right, back to the ironing board. So your outer, I keep calling it a different thing. So it's the outer bag, but it's the upper part. So they're going to look like this. You'll do this step of basting on the pocket twice for either side. And then once it's basted on, you're going to grab your strap and we'll attach this next. So what I'm going to do first is grab my marking tool, and from either edge of the pocket, I'm going to mark in 1/2 inch. And that is how I'll line up my strap. So 1/2 inch there, 1/2 inch at the top of the pocket, and then that line will continue up at the raw edge of the bag. And I'll do the same on this side. 1/2 inch at the bottom edge, top of the pocket, and top edge. So just make sure that when you're lining up your strap that it's not twisted. You just want it to be going the right way all the way around. And then I'm going to pin this in place so that either side, the bottom edge of the strap is lining up with the bottom edge of the bag. So the last thing I'll do before sewing these down is I'm going to take my Choco liner and I'm going to mark 1 inch down from the top edge along the straps. And I'm just going to do that on either edge of the strap. Okay, so I've marked here, here, and here, and here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew the strap down along either side of the strap, but I'm going to stop at these. So I'm going to stop 1 inch from the top, and that is because we're going to insert our lining later, and we want to leave that edge raw for now. So back to the sewing machine. Make sure that your machine is back on your regular stitch. If you are using super heavy fabric, I would recommend going up to like a 3.5 probably at the most, just because it helps your machine kind of get the fabric through the machine, and you don't need to use a small stitch for something like this, especially the strap. It's well supported. It's not, you know, something that is going to have a ton of tension on it, and it just helps. You can also change your presser foot pressure if that's an option on your machine and make it a little bit lighter, and that way it'll help the bulky fabric move through your feed dogs as well. Sewing these straps down, I am going to just sew along the same stitch line of the straps that's already there. So when we sewed the straps before, I'll just use that as my guide. So pretty easy, and I'm going to start at the bottom of the bag and sew up. Let's see. Make sure my needle's in the right position. Yes. And again, at the bottom, I'm not going to backstitch. At the top, I will. And just checking that I'm not going over any needles. I'm removing them as I need to, as I go, and then I'm also just making sure that the strap is staying in the position it needs to be. And so I'm going to backstitch here. And I'll move to the next side of that strap. I'll take out these pins because I don't need them anymore. Okay, so I backstitch at the end there, trim my threads, and I'll move on to the other side of the strap. This side I'm going to start at the top just because it's easier. That way I have the bulk of my project out from under my machine. So now I'm going to start with a back stitch. And then you don't need a back stitch at the end there. other side of that strap in the same way. This is a good point to sew on your bows, and it's up to you wherever you want these to go. What I do is very simple. I'm just gonna fold the piece in half lengthwise, or is that lengthwise? Yes, lengthwise. So I'll find the center, and then I'm gonna line up the bow here with the top edge of the pocket. So I'll just center that on the center of the strap, and I'm just gonna sew straight down and do a little bit of back stitching just to reinforce it. And that is it for sewing it on. Very simple. And then I'll just tie it so that it's kind of out of the way. Very cute. And I'll do my other one. And you can trim these shorter if you want. I kind of like having the exaggerated ends, but if they annoy you, you can make them shorter. And now we are gonna head to the ironing board and give this a press and then pin it to the bottom of the bag. All right, so I'll just give this one more press. So I have that, and I have the other half of my bag, and I'm going to align these so that so the base of the bag has a long end and a short end. So just make sure that you're doing this in the right direction. You'll know because they will be the same length. So it'll look like this. So right sides together, we're gonna pin these along the bottom edge of the top of the bag and the raw edge that is the same length. So I'm going to do a pin at the center and either end, and then maybe I'll do one in the center of those as well, just to make sure everything stays in the right spot. As I mentioned, this twill is a little bit stretchier than the canvas, the red canvas that I used, so it kind of grows a little bit as you sew it. So good thing to pin it in place so you can keep an eye on it. So that's what it'll look like when it's all sewn together. So let's go do that. We'll be sewing this edge with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, and I'm just using the default stitch length on my machine, which again is 2.5. I'm using my machine foot as a guide, a 3/8 inch guide, but make sure you check your machine to make sure you're lining it up correctly. And just remove your pins as you go. And again, I'm kind of lifting up my project to help feed it through. I'm also using my fingers to kind of push any excess fabric that I see kind of bubbling up towards the needle so that it can get eased under the foot and doesn't keep sliding towards the end of the project. And this helps avoid any kind of like creasing or excess fabric later. Okay. And it's not absolutely necessary to backstitch there, but it can help keep things together as you go. Those edges will be sewn in on themselves later, so if you didn't backstitch there, it's not a huge deal. I'm gonna head over to the ironing board to press this seam. I'm gonna press this so that the seam allowance underneath is going towards the bottom of the bag or towards the red fabric. And just gonna open up that seam and make sure that there's no excess fabric. I'm not really like pulling the seam open per se, but I am like helping it, just making sure that there's no fabric kind of creased over on itself. I'm gonna trim these really quick. I am constantly trimming as I go just to get any little threads out of the way, because I probably won't trim them later, to be honest. All right, now I'm gonna top stitch this edge here with 2 rows, or edge stitch rather, with 2 rows there. All right, so I'm just gonna kind of roll up the top of the bag so it's out of my way and line up the edge of the red canvas here with my edge stitch foot, move my needle over and stitch that seam allowance down underneath. You don't need to backstitch here. And I'm just lifting up my edge stitch guide whenever I get to a lot of bulk like this strap here. And then I'll do one more row of stitching. This is decorative, it's not required, but I do like the look of it, so it is totally up to you whether you do it or not. Let's see, was that the right length? Yes. So the way I'm doing this is I am lining up the edge of the red canvas here, and then I'm moving my needle over away from that to create that second row. I'm going to give the bag one more press before I get ready to sew the sides. This is kind of not your last opportunity to press the outside of the bag, but you do have less access to it as like one layer, so this helps. If your top stitching is not perfect like mine, don't worry about it. Then when I'm ready, I am going to fold the bag in half, right sides together, and just make sure you're not sewing your bows into your side seams. And line up your edges here so that these seams meet. And then I'll do the same on the other side. Again, make sure that your bows, if you are doing bows, they aren't getting sewn into the side seams. So match up your top edges. I'm going to use a 3/8 inch seam allowance to sew these side seams. And I will be back stitching at the start and end. I'm using the end of my ironing board, so you can't really see it, but I'm just going to press the side seams to one side. So it'll look like this, press to one side, and they can go in the same direction or opposite directions. And then I'm going to press the bottom here just flat, and this is to give myself a crease to line up my pocket. So what I'm going to do is, with the bag still inside out, ruler, and I have my pins because I want to pin this in place. It might take a little finessing, but I'm going to take a pin, stick it through that where the seam is, and make sure that it is lining up with the crease. Okay. And there we go, looking pretty good. Now that I have that pinned in place, I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to measure across at 5.5 inches. So this will be our kind of box corner that we're doing. And I'm using my ruler to make sure that I'm doing this straight. So lining up that stitching line here in the center with, and then I'll do the same for the other side. So just make sure that when you're kind of opening up that pocket, you're not catching any other fabric inside or straps or anything when you're sewing this. So again, using my pin and matching up my crease, my center crease here with my center seam here. And then marking. It doesn't really matter which side of the line that you pin on, just as long as you pin those together. All right, and we'll just sew those corners. I have my needle centered and I'm on my default stitch length, so I am just gonna backstitch when I start and end this sew line. Kind of using the pads of my fingers to help keep everything where it needs to be when I take out my pins. I've dealt with carpal tunnel and tendonitis, so I'm all for ergonomic sewing and really using your hands, being aware of your hands and using them in a mindful way, because it's really easy to put all of your stress into your hands when you're sewing. So that's why I like to give tips. Okay, so I'm gonna do the second corner here. Okay, I'm just gonna double check inside that everything looks good before I didn't sew in any straps or any bows. So now I'm gonna grab some scissors and I'm gonna trim off these corners. I'm gonna leave the seam allowance at about 3/8 of an inch. And just of course make sure that you're only cutting through what you need to cut through. But we don't need the bulk of those corners. So cutting that off. So you can just get rid of these and we'll turn our bag right side out. And now we just have to do our lining. I will give these corners a little press as well, as much as I can. But we have a nice little bag almost done. Okay, I'm just gonna give this lining piece a little press before I sew the sides up. So you're going to do right sides together and you're going to be sewing up either edge. One edge down here is going to be folded. This will be the opening of the bag. So I'm going to pin across either side. Like that. And make sure it's folded evenly. And then on one side of your bag, of your lining, you're going to want to sew to turn your project inside out, and then you're going to sew the rest of the way down. So my gap is going to be about just going to mark where, so I'm going to sew 2 inches down, then I'm going to leave a 7-inch, 6 or 7 inches should be good, and then I'll sew from here to here. So again, we have our opening here, the bottom of the bag, and then the 2 sides that we're going to sew. I'm starting with the side where I'm going to have a gap, and I'm going to use a 3/8 inch seam allowance. I am back stitching at the start and end of these stitches. So there's that, leaving that opening, and then and then on the other side, I'm just going to sew all the way up. So here's the gap we've left open, and then our lining. Just like with the bag, we're going to do our box corner. So I'm going to press the bottom of the lining just so I have that crease to work with. And I am going to press the side seams really quick. So again, I just press the side seams to one side, and then we'll do those box corners. So same way, you're going to open up that corner, find the center, and line it up with your crease, using that pin to make sure everything stays in place. That looks good. And then measuring across at the 5.5 mark. Okay. And the same for this side. Looking good. Measure to 5.5. And again, I'm making sure that that center stitch line is matching up with my ruler. The gingham or pattern you're working with may not quite match up, but that's the important part. just like before, we're going to trim off the corner and leave a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Quarter inch is fine too, but you probably don't want any more than that because it'll just be excess bulk. And now our lining is ready to get attached to the bag. You're going to want to grab your pins or clips, and you'll have your outer bag right side out. Again, I'm going to kind of try to get these bows under control before I go in. And the lining is wrong side out. So you're going to slip the bag inside the lining so that they are right sides together then. And I'm going to line up my side seams here. So side seam of the lining with side seam of the bag. That's the easiest to do first. And then you can align everything else. And again, just make sure you're not, the straps are actually going to go inside the bag. But I like to do that first so that I have those together. So straps go inside. Like that. Make sure they're out of the way. All your bows are out of the way, etc. And then and then we will pin the rest of the top of the bag together. So I'm just kind of pressing the straps away because they're kind of stiff, so they're wanting to fly back up. So I'm just pressing them down away from where I'm going to be sewing. Here we go. And then we're just going to we're going to quarter it, and then again. So I'm clipping this in 8ths. So this has like a little excess fabric, so I might want to adjust everything. And that can happen, again, with different weights of fabric, different weaves of fabric. One might be stretchier than another, even if you cut them at the same size. You know, once you start sewing with them and messing with them, one will stretch out more than the other, but we'll be able to ease these together just fine. So I'll do the same for this side. Just going to kind of hold it taut and try to match up the centers. You can also pre-mark around the edges in 8ths if you want to get real technical, but I feel like this works just fine, just kind of eyeballing it. Okay, now we're going to sew all the way around this. I'm going to take my tray table off. And you can really start at any point around the bag. I'm going to sew these together with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Just making sure that the raw edge of the lining and the bag are matching up as you go, and definitely want to try to match up those side seams. I'm not going to backstitch at the start of this because I'm coming all the way back around again, and then I'll backstitch. Again, just making sure that you're not catching straps or anything in that seam. Back stitch, and I'm just going to check around to make sure everything looks good. And I have like one little crease, but I think that'll iron out. All right, this is the fun part. This is all done, and I'm going to use this gap that I left to pull the bag right side out, just through there. So now we have our lining on our bag, and we're going to sew up this right here, this gap that we left. I just really simply just fold the that whole side. You can fold it in on itself. You can pin this if you need to before you sew it shut. But I just do it on my machine. Nobody's going to look inside your bag and be worried about it. So just do a little edge stitch to sew that shut. And you do need to do a back stitch at this point. Once that is all closed up, you can put the lining into the bag, and we're gonna just do some top stitching around this top edge. So I'm gonna iron it first, and then we'll top stitch around it, and we will be done. So while I'm doing this, I am just gonna try to make sure that this seam it's a little tricky, but I'm gonna iron this edge and just make sure that the seam is like all the way open. I kind of want the lining of the bag to be a little inside of the bag, just so it's not popping over the edge of the outer fabric. So I'm doing this by ironing from the inside of the bag, which I feel like I have more visibility, and I can make sure I know where the lining is. Like that. And just move the straps out of the way as you go. Okay, so I'm going to start at one of the side seams and line up the edge of the bag And I'm just going to start sewing all the way around. Definitely make sure that your bows are out of the way. Your straps you're going to be sewing over the straps to secure them down. So keep them just straight. You can pin them in place if you want to as well. And I'm just kind of rotating the project around the machine as I go, just helping it move. So I'll do this one row of top stitching and then I'll do a second just to mimic the other top stitching. But it's up to you if you just want to do the one. That's totally fine. Okay, I'm gonna tie my bows and then I'm just gonna give that top edge one more press and then we are done. Okay, just gonna make sure the lining is straight inside. Here's our finished bag, complete with lining and bows. You'll see that this has straps that are nice and long. You can fit over your shoulder. With this larger bag, with this sample, I decided to go with wider straps. So I'll include the option for that in the description as well, but you can also make this with thinner straps. I will say I like the look of these wider straps, but they aren't as comfortable to wear. So that is something to think about. These bags are constructed in the exact same way. So you can make either size, and I hope you really enjoy this project. Thanks so much.